Winter, 1886, hit Dakota Territory with a fury that exposed every weakness in frontier construction. One Norwegian immigrant had spent the summer building something his neighbors couldn't understand, a bizarre double shell around his log cabin that everyone agreed was a waste of perfectly good lumber. They'd watch him working in the heat, stacking boards a foot away from his perfectly solid walls, and they'd shake their heads. The man was clearly confused about basic cabin construction. You built one strong wall, chinked it tight, and that was sufficient. Adding a second barrier made no sense whatsoever. But when blizzard winds started driving snow through every microscopic gap in standard cabins, when families woke to frozen water buckets sitting 3 feet from their stoves, when interior temperatures dropped below zero despite fires burning constantly, that Norwegian's peculiar construction suddenly looked different. His cabin stayed 21 degrees warmer than neighboring structures, measured, documented, consistent. The man had understood something about physics that everyone else had dismissed as immigrant foolishness. If discovering how frontier innovations saved lives interests you, subscribe to Echoes Across the Frontier. Comment with your location. We track where these stories reach globally. Olson arrived in spring, carrying knowledge from 2 distinct sources that would prove critical. Growing up on Norway's coast had taught him that single barriers failed against persistent wind. His father's fish-drying sheds used double planking with air gaps between them. Working summers at Bergen's ice storage facility had taught him something else entirely. Sawdust packed between inner and outer walls could preserve winter ice through brutal July heat. The principle worked because trapped air couldn't circulate and steal temperature. Now claiming land where wind traveled unobstructed across 1,000 miles of flat prairie, he planned combining both lessons into residential construction. His log structure went up quickly, 14 by 18 feet, 9-foot walls, tight chinking, everything standard and proper. Neighbors approved and expected him moving on to agricultural work. Instead, he started setting vertical posts in a rectangle surrounding his completed cabin. 12 inches of gap between the posts and his logs. Perfect spacing. Careful measurement. Harwick, the road overseer who'd homesteaded since 1878, stopped to investigate. "What are you building?" "That looks like you're fencing in your house." "Wind barrier," Olson replied. "Like ice storage facilities use." Harwick spat tobacco. "That's wasted lumber. Good chinking stops wind just fine." Olson ignored him and continued working. He installed horizontal blocking between his vertical posts at 4-foot intervals, created a drainage gap at ground level, and covered it with the wire mesh, built framework that would hold whatever fill material he planned using. The outer skin took 4 full days, vertical boards running floor to ceiling, battens covering every seam, tin flashing at the roofline to shed water, ventilation slots under the eaves to allow moisture escape. Township gossip spread quickly. The Norwegian was building something nobody had witnessed before, and everyone agreed it made no sense. Martha Brennan, the school teacher, stopped to observe during early August. Unlike others, her tone carried curiosity rather than mockery. "What's the gap for?" "Still air holds heat," Olson explained. "Moving air steals it constantly. Creating dead space breaks wind circulation." His knowledge came partly from ice houses, but also from conversations with a Lakota woman at the general store. She described teepee liners, inner cloth walls creating calm zones between wind-catching outer hides and people inside. The trapped air stayed warmer and eliminated drafts. Olson realized he could build that same principle into permanent structures using rigid materials. While neighbors finished harvesting and began stockpiling firewood, Olson spent late summer cutting prairie hay. He built drying racks and gathered moss from creek beds, everything needed to cure completely dry before installation. The hay was cut short and kept loose. He'd calculated needing about 120 cubic feet of fill material, and he wanted it light enough to trap maximum air without compacting solid. "That'll rot by Christmas," Haugen predicted during another visit. "You'll have mice nesting throughout your walls." "Ice facilities use sawdust," Olson responded. "Stays dry with proper ventilation." By October, township opinion had settled into consistent mockery. The fence around Olson's house represented everything wrong with immigrant thinking. Wasteful, foolish, excessive. 1,200 board feet of lumber serving zero structural purpose. A foot-wide gap you could walk through surrounding perfectly adequate logs. But Olson kept working methodically. He filled the cavity carefully, tamping hay and moss to roughly 3 to 4 pounds per cubic foot. Dense enough remaining in place, light enough trapping air effectively. He tacked muslin at the top of each section, preventing fill from settling and creating cold spots. He hinged the outer boards like shutters at doors and windows, allowing access while maintaining weather sealing. The complete project consumed 2 months, 6 weeks longer than standard cabin construction required. Neighbors watched him labor through September heat and October cold, convinced they'd soon have proof that simpler was better. They didn't understand what Olson had learned from combining ice storage physics with Plains Indian wisdom. Blizzards weren't just cold temperatures. They were moving air under pressure. That movement forced infiltration through every tiny gap, overwhelming whatever insulation single walls provided. But a sacrificial outer skin could absorb wind force while a dead air cavity broke circulation patterns. The physics were proven, the materials were tested, the measurements were precise. By first snowfall, Olson's cabin was ready, demonstrating what neighbors dismissed as stubborn immigrant delusion. The test came October 15th. 3 feet of snow in 18 hours. Winds bending fence posts and stripping bark from trees. The storm arrived without typical warning signs. No cloud patterns, no pressure drops old-timers usually felt. One day, brown prairie. The next day, white drifts reaching cabin eaves and erasing wagon tracks completely. Haugen woke up finding inch-thick ice in his water bucket, positioned 4 feet from his banked stove. Frost coated his interior walls where breath had condensed and frozen overnight. He rekindled his fire with shaking hands, watching flames struggle against drafts coming from seemingly every direction simultaneously. Outside, sustained winds above 35 miles per hour rattled his door and sent snow puffs through gaps he'd believed were sealed. Dawn thermometer reading. 22 below zero outside. Inside felt barely warmer than freezing. He'd burned through his evening wood allocation, plus half the next day's supply, just attempting to prevent water from solidifying. The problem wasn't his stove or fuel quality. Wind was driving cold air through every microscopic crack, while simultaneously sucking heated air out through leeward gaps. Single-wall construction provided hundreds of infiltration points where wind-driven cold could penetrate. The logs themselves conducted exterior cold directly to interior surfaces, radiating it into living spaces. Martha Brennan faced identical physics a mile south. She'd banked her fire carefully before sleeping, leaving coals that should have lasted until morning. Instead, she woke to a cold stove and temperatures making her breath visible. Ice had formed on her interior log surfaces, creating crystalline coating that thickened as body heat met frozen wood. She wrapped herself in every available quilt, struggling to restart fire with fingers too stiff for striking matches properly. The mechanism destroying comfort was invisible, but relentless. Blizzard winds create pressure differentials transforming any structure into a giant bellows. Air forces through windward gaps, while heated interior air escapes through leeward openings. 3 miles northeast, midwife Sarah McKenna made rounds, checking families with vulnerable members. Young children and elderly who couldn't survive prolonged sub-freezing indoor exposure. At the Johansson place, she found the family huddled in one corner, burning chair legs, supplementing dwindling firewood. The baby's lips showed bluish tinge, despite wool blanket wrapping. At the Morrison cabin, the old grandfather sat dangerously close to the stove, clothes nearly catching fire, yet hands too cold for holding a coffee cup steady. Every cabin told the same story. Families burning 1.5 to twice normal evening wood, just reaching 40 or 45 degrees by bedtime. Water buckets freezing solid overnight near stoves. Cooking and breathing moisture, condensing on interior walls, freezing into ice sheets, making logs feel even colder. Wind wasn't merely lowering temperatures. It was actively pumping heat from supposedly sealed structures. Meanwhile, at Olson's double-walled cabin, different physics were operating. The Norwegian had banked his fire identically to neighbors. Same wood quantity, same coal arrangement. But his outer boards were absorbing wind's full force, creating turbulence and pressure relief in the 12-inch cavity filled with loose hay and moss. The actual log structure sat in relatively calm air, protected from convective pumping defeating every other cabin. The loose, fibrous fill performed exactly like sawdust in commercial ice houses. Each hay strand and moss clump created tiny air pockets preventing free circulation. Moving air steals heat through convection, but trapped air held motionless by fibrous material becomes an insulating barrier. Icehouse operators had relied on this principle for decades, preserving winter ice through summer heat. Now it worked in reverse, preserving winter heat through blizzard cold. By the storm's third day, temperature differential became undeniable. Harwick trudged through knee-deep snow, checking on his Norwegian neighbor, expecting finding Olson in identical, desperate conditions. Instead, he found the immigrant calmly splitting kindling indoors, working in shirt sleeves, while snow continued accumulating against outer walls. Olson's water bucket showed zero ice formation. Interior walls remained frost-free. Most remarkably, his evening fire had lasted through night, with adequate coals for easy morning restart. The contrast was so extreme that Harwick initially suspected trickery. Hidden stoves or secret fuel explaining impossible warmth. The explanation was simpler and more profound. Dead air trapped between fibrous materials creates insulating barriers wine cannot penetrate. The outer wall absorbed storm's mechanical energy while the inner wall remained in thermal stability zones. This wasn't magic or luck. It was applied physics any icehouse foreman could explain, adapted by a man understanding that identical principles preserving cold in summer could preserve heat in winter. The storm raged 7 more days. Each dawn, the difference grew more pronounced. Single-wall cabins were losing infiltration battles, while Olson's double shell won through superior engineering disguised as excessive construction. On the 4th morning, Olson began keeping a ledger. He'd noticed Martha Brennan's careful record-keeping during school visits and understood that numbers would carry more weight than claims when neighbors finally asked how his cabin stayed warm. Each dawn at 6 o'clock, he recorded paired temperature readings using a mercury thermometer purchased from Jamestown Hardware. One measurement at the outer sill where plank walls met ground. Another at interior log surfaces 3 feet from his stove. Results were consistent and dramatic. October 19th, with stove banked to coal since midnight. Outer sill read 14 below zero. Interior log wall registered 7 above. 21-degree difference. October 20th showed similar patterns. 6 below outside the planks, 5 above at inner logs. Day after day, temperature differentials held between 17 and 23 degrees, with best single readings reaching 21 degrees of protection. Harwick arrived on the 7th day, desperate enough for direct questions. He found Olson writing figures in a small leather notebook, carefully documenting what seemed impossible. "How does your fire last all night?" Harwick demanded. His own cabin required constant feeding, maintaining any heat whatsoever. Olson demonstrated with smoke first. He lit his pipe and blew smoke toward the outer wall, where it immediately bent horizontal and disappeared through invisible gaps between planks. Then he repeated the test at interior log surfaces, holding a feather near chinking. The feather barely stirred. "Outer wall absorbs wind," Olson explained. "Inner wall sits in calm air." Physics became clear through demonstration. The 12-inch cavity filled with the loose hay and moss was creating what icehouse operators called a cold buffer, sacrificial zones absorbing storm energy before reaching structural walls. Commercial ice facilities used identical principles with sawdust or tan bark packed between inner and outer partitions. Fibrous fill trapped air in countless tiny pockets, preventing circulation that would otherwise pump heat away through convection. Harwick studied Olson's fuel consumption with growing disbelief. The Norwegian's evening wood bundle, measured by arm load and stacked for counting, was 35 to 45% smaller than what Harwick needed, achieving identical interior temperature. Both men targeted 52 to 55 degrees by 8 o'clock each evening, reasonable frontier comfort levels. But where Harwick burned 6 to 8 split logs reaching that goal, Olson needed only 4 or 5 similar-sized pieces. The difference lay in heat retention rather than heat generation. Harwick's single-wall cabin fought constant infiltration, cold air streaming through microscopic gaps, while warm air escaped through others. His stove worked against continuous thermal drain, making efficient heating impossible. Olson's double wall had eliminated that drain by creating dead air barriers wind couldn't penetrate. Martha Brennan arrived on the 8th day, documenting the phenomenon herself. As district school teacher, keeping weather records for territorial government, she understood systematic measurement value. She brought her own thermometer and spent an hour taking readings at various points around both cabins. At Harwick's place, she recorded interior lows of 5 below to 5 above, just before dawn, with ice forming in water buckets throughout nights. At Olson's cabin, she found steady readings between 10 and 14 degrees at identical pre-dawn hours, with zero ice formation anywhere inside. The mechanism deepened under scrutiny rather than collapsing. Modern insulation understanding centers on trapped air, the principle that motionless air creates thermal resistance while moving air destroys it. Straw bale construction, developed decades later, would demonstrate R values of 1.2 to 4 per inch by using dense straw trapping air in fibrous matrices. Olson's loose hay and moss, while less dense, operated on identical physics. Each strand created microscopic air pockets, preventing free circulation, building thermal resistance through stillness rather than density. The teepee liner analogy became more relevant as the storm continued. Plains tribes had used inner cloth walls for generations, creating 3 to 9 foot gaps, trapping calm air and controlling drafts. The principle was identical: outer skin catching weather, inner wall for living, and dead air between them for thermal protection. The Lakota woman who'd explained liner construction to Olson at the general store had unknowingly described identical physics, making icehouse insulation functional. Cultural knowledge from plains tribes and industrial practice from European ice storage had converged in Olson's design, though neither source fully understood the thermodynamics underlying their empirical observations. By the 10th day, Olson's temperature differentials were averaging 18 to 20 degrees between outer and inner wall surfaces. His fuel savings remained consistent at roughly 40% less wood consumption for equivalent interior comfort levels. Most critically, his cabin maintained livable conditions without the desperate measures his neighbors were adopting: burning furniture, sleeping fully clothed under multiple blankets, or abandoning outlying rooms to concentrate heat in single spaces. The storm finally broke on October the 22nd, leaving the township buried under drifts requiring weeks to melt. But thermal lessons were permanently recorded in Olson's ledger and in neighbor memories who'd experienced the difference between fighting wind and deflecting it. The double wall had proven itself not through theoretical argument, but through measurable performance during the worst conditions Dakota Territory could deliver. When Harwick finally requested seeing construction details, Olson walked him through the method without commentary or self-congratulation. The 12-inch cavity, the loose fill at 3 to 4 pounds per cubic foot, the ventilation slots preventing moisture buildup, the sacrificial outer skin taking weather damage while preserving structural logs. Every element served measurable functions in creating thermal stability that single walls couldn't match. The killing week had ended, but its lessons would spread through the township as neighbors realized that excessive preparation had proven exactly sufficient preparation, and that principles borrowed from ice storage and Plains Indian wisdom could mean the difference between survival and surrender when winter decided testing what men had built against its fury. The second storm arrived November 3rd with 40-mile-per-hour winds and temperatures dropping to 38 below zero. This time, the crisis was immediate and life-threatening in ways the first storm hadn't been. At the Morrison cabin, the grandfather's breathing became labored in air so cold it burned his lungs with each inhalation. At the Johansson place, the baby developed a rattling cough, worsening each night as interior temperatures fell below freezing despite fires consuming their remaining chair legs and half their floorboards. Sarah McKenna made her rounds on the second day and found conditions demanding immediate action. At 3 separate cabins, she discovered families burning their furniture, supplementing exhausted wood supplies while water froze solid in containers positioned directly beside red-hot stoves. Wind was driving infiltration so severe that heated air disappeared as rapidly as fires could produce it. Frostbite was beginning to threaten fingers and toes of children and elderly who couldn't generate adequate body heat, compensating for the thermal drain. When families began appearing at Olson's door requesting shelter, he opened his outer shutters without hesitation and walked them through the cavity of his construction, explaining the physics as they entered. Harwick arrived first with his wife and 2 young sons, followed by the Morrisons carrying blankets and the failing grandfather. The Johanssons came last, the mother clutching her coughing baby while the father dragged a sack of their remaining possessions through knee-deep snow. 11 people crowded into Olson's 14 by 18-foot cabin, but the double wall system proved capable of handling the increased load without significant performance degradation. The Norwegian added extra muslin baffles at the vestibule he'd built around his outer door, creating an airlock that reduced infiltration by another 10 to 15%. He demonstrated this improvement by holding burning pipe tobacco near the floor At the inner door threshold, where smoke now deflected less than an eighth of an inch instead of the quarter-inch movement they'd observed before the baffles went up, the refugee families experienced thermal stability they hadn't felt in weeks. Water containers remained liquid throughout nights. Children stopped shivering and could remove their outer coats indoors without immediately feeling cold. The grandfather's labored breathing eased as he no longer had to work against frigid air stressing his aged lungs. Most remarkably, the combined evening fuel burn for all 11 people was 30% less per person than what the individual families had been consuming in their failed single-wall cabins. The efficiency gains from proper thermal barriers more than compensated for the additional body heat load. Olson spent the third day teaching emergency retrofits to neighbors who still clung to their own claims rather than abandoning them completely. The technique was simple, but effective enough to mean the difference between survival and death. Lash staked plank screens 8 to 12 inches off the windward walls, stuff the gap with loose straw from barn reserves, then line the interior walls with blankets or muslin to limit drafts and create additional dead air layers. The materials were crude compared to his planned construction, but the physics remained fundamentally sound. Any barrier creating trapped air would provide some insulation value, even if inferior to properly engineered systems. Harwick implemented the emergency method first, using rough boards and baling wire, creating a sacrificial windscreen along his cabin's north and west faces, where prevailing winds hit hardest. He packed the gap with straw from his livestock feed supply and hung wool blankets inside, creating an additional air barrier. The installation was hasty and imperfect, but within 48 hours, his pre-dawn interior temperatures had risen 12 to 16 degrees compared to the previous week's readings. Not as effective as Olson's full double shell, with its carefully calculated cavity width and properly cured fill materials, but survivable. And survivable was all that mattered when the alternative was freezing to death in your own home. The Morrison family followed the same approach on their cabin, focusing retrofit efforts on the bedroom where the grandfather slept, since protecting the most vulnerable family member was the highest priority. They used canvas wagon covers instead of planks for the outer screen and filled the gap with hay salvaged from their summer cutting. The material was less than ideal, not fully dried, not cut to optimal length, but it functioned adequately. The improvement was immediate and measurable. Frost stopped forming on the interior log surfaces in the grandfather's room, and the old man's breathing returned to normal rhythms during sleep. His body was no longer fighting constant cold stress just to maintain core temperature. Martha Brennan documented the emergency retrofits with the same careful measurement she'd applied to Olson's original construction. Her records showed that even crude temporary double walls produced interior temperature gains of 10 to 18 degrees when winds exceeded 30 miles per hour. The effect was less pronounced during calm periods when infiltration wasn't as severe, but became absolutely critical during storm conditions when infiltration reached life-threatening levels. The difference between a 10-degree improvement and no improvement was often the difference between survival and death for vulnerable individuals. The Johansson baby recovered within 5 days of moving into Olson's cabin, where steady interior warmth allowed her small body to fight off the respiratory infection that had developed in constantly cold air. Sarah McKenna noted that the child's improvement coincided directly with exposure to consistent temperatures above freezing, something that had been impossible to maintain in the family's single-wall homestead, despite burning furniture and depleting their entire wood reserve. By November 10th, the immediate crisis had passed as the second storm finally broke, but the lessons were permanently embedded in community memory. Families who had experienced thermal stability behind double walls could no longer ignore the fundamental inadequacy of single-wall construction in high-wind environments where infiltration overwhelmed traditional chinking methods. The emergency, retrofits had proven that the principle worked even with crude materials and hasty installation executed by inexperienced builders working under crisis conditions. This was important because it meant the technique was accessible to anyone willing to invest labor, not just to skilled craftsmen with access to premium materials. Olson's vestibule modification became a standard recommendation for anyone attempting the double wall method in future construction. The airlock effect reduced infiltration at the most vulnerable point, the door threshold, where human traffic created unavoidable gaps that couldn't be permanently sealed. Smoke tests showed that proper vestibule baffles could eliminate most floor-level drafts that otherwise undermine interior heating efforts by creating cold air currents flowing across living spaces. The social dynamics of the township shifted during those crowded days in Olson's cabin. Men who had mocked the fence around a house found themselves asking detailed questions about gap width, fill materials, ventilation requirements, and construction sequencing. The Norwegian answered without criticism or self-vindication, sharing measurements and techniques as practical information rather than personal triumph or vindication of his judgment. He understood that the goal was community survival, not proving himself right and his neighbors wrong. When the second storm finally broke after 6 brutal days, 11 people had survived severe cold that would almost certainly have killed some of them in single-wall shelters without adequate thermal protection. The grandfather lived, the baby recovered, and families returned to their own claims with first-hand knowledge of what thermal stability felt like and how it could be achieved using methods within their economic and technical reach. More importantly, they carried practical methods for achieving that stability using materials and techniques within reach of any homesteader willing to invest the labor. The knowledge had been democratized through crisis, spreading from one man's specialized knowledge to community-wide understanding through direct experience. The emergency retrofits remained in place through the rest of winter, providing measurable comfort improvements and fuel savings that validated the double-wall principle under real-world conditions across multiple implementations and material choices. What had begun as one man's excessive construction had become a community survival strategy, proven not through argument or theoretical demonstration, but through the simple observable fact that people stayed warm when wind tried to freeze them. Spring came early in 1887, but by then the requests for construction details had already begun from both existing homesteaders, planning improvements and new arrivals, planning their initial builds. Harwick was the first to request formal specifications, appearing at Olson's door in late March with a notebook and a measuring tape. He wanted dimensions, spacing intervals, and a complete bill of materials. Not for himself, he claimed, but for his brother-in-law, who was planning to homestead the following year. Olson provided the information without commentary or conditions: 12-inch cavity minimum for adequate air trapping, cedar pickets at 36-inch spacing for structural stability, ledger blocks every 48 inches maintaining frame squareness, 1x10 planks for the outer skin with 1x3 battens covering vertical joints, half-inch vent slots at the eaves allowing moisture escape without excessive heat loss. Martha Brennan made the second formal request, this time for inclusion in her annual report to the Territorial Education Office. She had documented the thermal performance through 2 major storms with systematic temperature measurements and fuel consumption tracking, and wanted to preserve the technical details for other frontier teachers who might face similar challenges in remote schoolhouses that needed better heating solutions. Olson walked her through the entire system methodically, the woven wires screening at the base gap, preventing fill material from spilling while allowing drainage, the muslin wind check above the loose fill, preventing settling and maintaining consistent insulation value, the tin flashing that shed melt water away from the cavity, preventing moisture accumulation, the hinged outer shutters that provided storm protection for windows and doors while allowing access when needed. By summer, 3 of the 7 nearby homesteads had ordered lumber for permanent double-wall construction, representing significant capital investment based on observed performance during the previous winter's crisis. The Morrison family committed first, investing in a complete retrofit that would protect their grandfather through another winter. They chose a 14-inch cavity instead of 12, using sawdust from the Jamestown mill where prairie hay was scarce and transportation costs made it expensive. The wider gap allowed for denser packing while maintaining the dead air principle that made the system effective. Sawdust, being finer than hay, packed more densely but still trapped adequate air for insulation purposes. The blacksmith who serviced stoves throughout the township noted practical differences at cabins with double walls that affected his business significantly. He found fewer smokeback problems and steadier draws because the inner walls sat in calm air rather than fighting constant pressure differentials that affected draft performance. His repair visits dropped significantly at double-walled structures, and he began recommending the construction method to homesteaders as a way to improve stove efficiency and reduce maintenance costs over time. Construction details spread through informal networks rather than formal instruction or published guidelines. Neighbors observed each other's building techniques during barn raisings and harvest cooperation, noting gap widths, fill materials, and ventilation strategies that seemed to work best under local conditions. The Johansons opted for a 16-inch cavity filled with a mixture of sawdust and moss, reasoning that wider spacing would provide better insulation despite higher material costs and additional labor for fill procurement and installation. The Brennans chose 12 inches but used all sawdust, following icehouse practice more closely than Olson's original hay and moss combination. This reflected different resource availability and different trade-offs between material costs and labor time. Results from the second winter validated the method across multiple implementations using different specifications and materials. Martha Brennan kept detailed fuel consumption records for all 3 double-wall cabins, documenting 25 to 40% reductions in evening wood requirements to reach 55-degree interior targets. More importantly, none of the retrofitted homes experienced frozen water containers indoors during storm periods, and all maintained pre-dawn temperatures above 10 degrees throughout January's worst cold snaps, when single-wall cabins were seeing interior temperatures drop below zero regularly. The Johansen baby thrived through her second winter, showing none of the respiratory distress that had nearly killed her the previous year. Sarah McKenna attributed the improvement directly to consistent interior warmth that allowed the child's developing lungs to function normally, rather than fighting constant cold stress that compromised immune function. The grandfather Morrison lived to see spring and credited his survival to sleeping in air that stayed above freezing throughout the night, allowing his aged body to rest rather than burning all its energy just maintaining core temperature. Maintenance requirements proved manageable, but consistent across different implementations. Outer plank skins needed rebattening every 3 to 5 years as weather loosened the strips that sealed vertical joints, Regular inspection and minor repairs prevented major deterioration. Hay and moss fill required replacement every 2 to 3 years, particularly after wet seasons when moisture penetrated the cavity, despite ventilation slots. The organic materials would eventually decompose or compact, reducing insulation value. Sawdust fill lasted longer but cost more initially, creating a trade-off between labor frequency and material expense that different families evaluated differently based on their specific circumstances and resource availability. The method's reputation spread beyond the immediate township through correspondence networks that connected frontier communities across the territory. County agents began including double-wall construction details in their agricultural bulletins, treating the technique as proven field practice rather than experimental innovation requiring further testing. The approach aligned with established icehouse insulation methods, giving it technical credibility that helped overcome resistance to frontier improvisation. When agents could point to decades of successful commercial ice storage using similar principles, skeptical homesteaders were more willing to invest in the technique. By 1890, the double-wall principle had appeared in formal agricultural extension publications, reaching audiences far beyond Dakota Territory. A correspondent for the Dakota Farmer wrote detailed articles on dead air insulation, complete with diagrams showing proper cavity widths, fill densities, and ventilation requirements for various climate zones. The technique was described as particularly valuable in high-wind regions where standard chinking could not prevent infiltration during severe weather events that created pressure differentials overwhelming traditional construction methods. Modern building science would later validate every aspect of Olson's original method, using thermodynamic principles and quantitative measurement. Dead air remains the fundamental insulating principle in contemporary construction, with moving air destroying thermal resistance, while trapped air provides it. Fibrous materials like straw continue to demonstrate respectable R values by preventing air circulation within wall cavities, following identical physics that Olson had applied without formal training in thermodynamics or materials science. High-wind infiltration still overwhelms inadequate thermal barriers, making wind-resistant construction essential in exposed locations where pressure differentials can drive air exchange rates high enough to make interior heating economically and practically impossible. The physics Olson had borrowed from icehouse practice and Plains Indian wisdom became standard frontier survival knowledge within a decade of his first double-wall cabin, spreading across the northern plains through both formal and informal knowledge transfer networks. Homesteaders throughout the region adopted variations of the method, adjusting cavity widths and fill materials to local conditions while maintaining the core principle of sacrificial outer walls, protecting structural inner walls through dead air barriers that wine couldn't penetrate. What had begun as one Norwegian's excessive preparation became documented best practice for extreme climate construction, eventually influencing building codes and construction standards as the frontier era gave way to more formal settlement patterns. The method required more initial labor and materials than single-wall building, creating higher upfront costs that deterred some homesteaders. But the thermal performance and fuel savings justified the investment across multiple building seasons for those who could afford it. Most importantly, families stayed warm and survived weather that had proven lethal in conventional construction, validating Olson's approach through the most meaningful metric possible: human survival. The legacy lived in practical terms rather than grand recognition or historical commemoration. Children grew up healthy in consistently heated homes without respiratory infections from constant cold exposure. Elderly members survived winters that would have killed them in drafty cabins where infiltration overwhelmed heating capacity. Fuel consumption dropped to sustainable levels that preserved precious wood supplies for essential uses beyond heating, allowing families to allocate labor toward productive activities rather than constant fuel gathering. On the plains, where wind never stopped testing what men built against its force, Olson's method had taken the teeth out of winter before it could reach the wall where people lived and families endured through seasons that killed the unprepared.